I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor.
Weight loss drugs. I've had a colleague of mine called Ozempic or Semaglutide drug of the year. And I agree that this is a conversation that I went from hearing really infrequently, like maybe once every 6 months, to having this conversation almost daily. And so I felt like it was a good idea for us to sit down and talk about where things are at with respect to the data on weight loss drugs, and to also give you some food for thought and insight around how to think about this particular treatment option and this kind of, I guess, problem that we have with decision making in medicine. This really highlights a lot of issues, this particular conversation. So I know that as you hit play on this episode, you're like, just give us the goods, Jordan. Is this a good thing to do or not a good thing to do? And I truly believe that this conversation is a lot more nuanced than that. And I want to spend time there in the nuances, because invariably we're going to see some challenges, pushback, regulation, shortages, question around who's more and less deserving of this medication as we start to broaden the criteria of who is allowed, and I'm using that term really loosely, but who we are recommending these medications for. And so I do think it's important that we sit in the complexity of the decisions around all medication, but weight loss drugs certainly bring up a very different set of emotions and morality around, and I really think it's super important that we sit there. It's funny, as I had made the decision to do this topic, I was going to think about it from a much more clinical perspective. What does the data say? How much weight do people lose? Who does benefit? And at the same time as I was planning for this podcast and creating some content for my clinician group, there was a news article published about using bariatric surgery and weight loss medications in an adolescent population, published in a newspaper. And it started to make the rounds or circulate on social media with, of course, lots of people in my industry feeling very negatively about, is this what we've come to? We're now going to medicate this next generation of individuals because we won't fix things at the systemic level. And I thought it was such an interesting piece. And this is why I kind of wanted to sit here in the discomfort of this conversation, because for some reason, the conversation around obesity brings up more feelings than any other conversation around medication use, treatment options, etc. And I do think that if, as I'm talking about weight loss medication, you're noticing that within yourself, you're thinking about some, like, I'm going to call them should statements, like, we should be able to figure this out without medication. We should fix medicine so that we don't get to this place with so many patients. Kids shouldn't need weight loss medication. Like, that's interesting and that's fine. And yet I would argue that you probably couldn't insert any other medical condition in place of the words obesity or weight loss and say those same sentences with that same feeling, right? So if I said we shouldn't have rheumatoid arthritis and patients with rheumatoid arthritis should be able to figure out how to manage their disease without medication. We shouldn't have to resort to disease-modifying agents in these patients. Like, you can see how it doesn't really stand up that well. You can insert any other condition. And I would say at one time we maybe felt that way about mental health, right? At one time we thought, well, just put your chin up and go look at the sun, and you shouldn't need medication. Or we shouldn't be failing our children by having them have anxiety. And yes, there are systemic challenges within the healthcare system that put us all at risk of some of these diseases, mental health, obesity included. But that doesn't mean that we don't need a here and now solution for these issues, right? The upstream problem of obesity, whether that's access to food, whether that's education, whether that's poverty, whatever it is, doesn't mean we don't need a downstream solution today. Because we all know that those upstream challenges and problems take a long time to steer that ship. And there are many people that are suffering from their obesity today that aren't going to have an opportunity to benefit from policy change. So we can actually have both. We can have both an upstream problem and require a downstream solution from that patient that actually gets some people help today and other people maybe prevention or help tomorrow. But watching that adolescent article go viral made me feel like we were sitting on two sides of the fence. It was like, well, we're going to medicate our kids because this is what it's come to, or we're going to have policy change, or we need to focus on policy change. But the reality is that there is some adolescent out there right now whose greatest health risk is their today obesity. And we have solutions that have been proven to be safe and effective to treat them. And so you never would say, well, we have some mental health supports that would prevent suicide in this young adolescent, but what we really need is a policy change so that they have better mentorship in the school system. Right? You wouldn't. We just wouldn't put each other at risk in that way. We would not accept that solution where another generation might benefit, but today's generation won't. We just wouldn't. And so we need to be willing to sit in this obesity conversation and say, maybe we have some policy challenges, but we have a today solution as well. And so I really want you to think quite hard about some of those should statements that come up while I'm talking about this or while you're thinking about it, because we can have both. We can have shit policy that doesn't protect people from health challenges, and we can have a pharmaceutical solution that we use today. So that's the first piece. Like, there is a huge morality around weight loss medications. And, you know, I'm not sure why we care what other medications people are using for their health conditions, right? I don't know why we care what other people are going to do to treat their obesity. Like, the only reason you would care is if you felt like you had something to lose by that other person choosing something that you wouldn't choose or don't want them to choose. So I think when we see this polarization of that conversation online, you have to ask, like, why does that person care so much about what other people do to treat their obesity? My guess is that they try and treat obesity. That's my guess. Because why, in other words, why would we care? Or if you're just a member of the public and you really care about what other people are doing to treat their obesity, what is that bringing up for you? How is that making you feel when you say, well, we shouldn't be using medication for obesity? Why do you think that way? What it comes up for you? Is there something about the way that you feel about yourself? Is there some shame that you have about your body or your health that's making you feel the need to comment on someone else's? Because the real thing is like we have some drug-based solutions right now for obesity that are having a real impact, a real positive impact. And yet, for some reason, we all feel the need to comment about it. If you're not obese and this is not on the table for you as a medication, shut up. Right? Doesn't matter. Like, yeah, I don't think your opinion actually should be here at the table. And I know that that's blunt and that's me being way more blunt and bitey than I normally am, but it's bothering me that we are even feeling the need to comment about this, because I think when we're commenting about it, it means we really don't understand obesity and the complexity and the challenge of it as a chronic disease. I think if you have a big judgment about weight loss drugs, you still think obesity is a choice, and you're wrong. Okay. So let's actually talk about the medications. And so we totally don't know how they work completely. There's lots of thoughts about that. We have some decent ideas about why and how we think it's working. And remember, when these drugs first went to market, the goal was to treat diabetes. So why you're seeing this sudden increase in discussion about it is because this drug, which was reserved for treating people with diabetes, and to be diabetic, you had to sort of cross this threshold around blood sugar regulation. But now it's being used to treat obesity or patients who have a moderately high BMI, say 27, but who are suffering from or at incredible risk of cardiometabolic conditions that go along with that. So, crossing that sort of threshold of BMI into that obese category would make you qualify for this medication at this time. Or if you fall slightly below that, but we can see the sort of entire picture of your health is really pointing towards being at risk as a consequence of insulin resistance and that metabolic syndrome sort of piece. But that's why we're starting to see sort of this hit the papers. Is because we're widening the group of individuals that we feel like would benefit from it. And it's done as a once weekly subcutaneous injection for the most part. There is an oral version, although quite frankly, the subcutaneous injection is quite a bit more it's simpler, right, from a compliance perspective. And again, remember that we're maybe using this in place of insulin in some patients. And so using a once a week injection versus multiple daily injections had a massive plus. But there definitely are some oral versions available that I think actually it's only available in the US and is not available currently in Canada. It's just questionable whether or not we care to use it, just given that a once a week sub-Q injection is quite convenient. And so we think that it works because it's called a GLP. They're GLP drugs. And so they influence aspects around satiety, meaning how full you feel. They seem to influence the brain, even as far as food choices. It really is influencing appetite regulation and food intake. So it brings someone's food intake down, which helps lower body weight. Okay, so it improves satiety, reduces cravings. It changes even food preferences in a couple of the studies that people gravitate towards different food choices. And it overall reduces energy intake, which is that math equation on helping reduce body weight. We do think it's maybe causing delayed gastric emptying, meaning that it slows digestion down. Although there are a couple of contrasting studies on that, so I don't know if we think that that's one of the number one reasons why it's improving body weight, because it's slowing down digestion. That one is a little bit more conflicting, but that gets listed often as one of the ways that it's working is by slowing down digestion. So does it work, right? I think this is the meat of it. And the reality is that it does work. And the couple of interesting things about it. So if we're going to recommend weight loss for someone where weight is a health risk for them, and let's remember, we've done hundreds of podcasts on this podcast around whether or not we need to lose weight. Right? And you can go back and listen to other episodes where we've talked about weight from a very compassionate perspective. We've talked about body image, and we've talked about midlife body changes. And there are many, 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 many reasons why patients maybe need to put down their weight loss goal. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about patients who have health risks that are associated with their BMI or with their body weight, that medically, one of the decisions on the table or one of the options on the table for them is weight loss. does this medication work? Okay, that's kind of where we're going to live, or the sandbox we're going to play in today, not whether or not you need to lose weight, not whether or not aesthetically it's important that people lose weight, whether we should shoot towards particular body ideals. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying if medically we're going to recommend that someone loses weight for their cardiovascular risk, does this drug play a role in those decisions, and should we be looking at this? So when we talk about medical weight loss, right? So we're not doing it from an aesthetic perspective. We're not doing it because you want to lose those last couple of pounds. We're talking about medical weight loss, where we need to make a remarkable change to a patient's body weight in order to support their health risks. We know that patients losing about 5% of their initial body weight, if they're obese, changes their long-term outcomes. And what we mean by outcomes is like big things, the big scaries, heart attacks, strokes, right? Cardiometabolic disease, diabetes. We change the prevalence incidence of these pieces if we lower a person's who is obese's body weight by 5% from their starting weight. And so that in the research has become this shiny object that we move towards. When we hold up weight loss interventions, that's the outcome that we're looking for. Is there a 5% reduction from initial starting weight in that patient? And are they able to maintain that change? And so the research that's on Ozempic or Semaglutide for diabetic patients does see positive outcomes. And when they started to expand the group that we were researching and looking at pre-diabetic patients, or patients who have insulin resistance but don't yet have diabetes, we actually found that more of them benefited, and they benefited more. So this is really interesting, because thinking back to the beginning conversation when I said, would we ever withhold treatment from someone for any other medical condition? Hopefully you said no. And with weight management and with weight loss, we often have this vision that the person needs to have tried everything before they would reach for medication. Right? Like we would place that maybe as a goal, like last resort, semaglutide. Except that's not actually what the research suggests. The research actually suggests that patients who are in the pre-diabetic range actually benefit more. Meaning if we catch patients before they've crossed this threshold into diabetic, or perhaps before their BMI exceeds a certain range, we're not helping them as much. So their magnitude of benefit, we call it, meaning how good it gets for them or how much of an impact it has, the drug by percentage has a lower impact the farther down the path patients have walked towards diabetes. And they actually have the greatest amount to gain if we treat them earlier. So it's interesting, right? Because again, bringing up the morality piece, we would maybe say, well, we'll only consider medication if ... we've done everything. That's not what the research suggests. The research suggests we probably should try and support you sooner in that journey than waiting until the last moment. And so the widening of our use of this medication isn't just about, I'm sure there's some part of it that's about profit. I'm not saying that it's not. But it's not just about that. The research actually supports having conversations before you get to that point of being diabetic, where we can actually see outcomes be better than if we wait and treat you later. So there's a bunch of research trials that have been done on semaglutide. The STEP trials are great and certainly have sliced patients looking for support with semaglutide in various ways, right? Are you diabetic, pre-diabetic? What happens if we treat you for 1 year? What happens if we treat you for 2 years? What happens if we watch and wait, right? Like they've looked at it from all sorts of different angles. And there are other couple of great trials. The SELECT trials also are great. Pioneer is another study group that's looking specifically at semaglutide. And they all generally are saying the same thing. We've started to see just some nuanced discussion. What about in PCOS? What about in adolescence? But in general, the conversation is pretty much saying the same thing. patients achieve a significant weight loss, so between 10 and 12% generally. Remember, I said 5% was clinically meaningful. And that outcome is really, really difficult for us to achieve in a diet and lifestyle trial, right? So when we say, well, we should do everything else first, like we actually don't really have that many solutions that have been shown to have that magnitude of benefit in this population. When we do like extensive behavior lifestyle change, usually we see a very modest improvement in BMI or modest reduction in body weight. Whereas with these medications, we're seeing a 10 to 12% reduction in body weight during the active phase of treatment, which is really quite encouraging, actually. You know, just to get into the nitty gritty of some of the other data, we do think that things kind of plateau. It seems lots of the studies have people plateauing in and around that year mark, which is really fascinating because I just know from an insurance perspective in Canada, there's so many rules and things like hoops you need to jump through for your Ozempic to be covered, that some patients don't qualify to use the medication past a year or past 6 months if they're not meeting those targets. But that's generally what the research suggests, is that you need to be taking it probably for a year to see that like magnitude of benefit. And the percentage of patients who drop down into having normal blood sugar out of that pre-diabetic state is really significant. Like we're talking like 80% of patients who entered the study having some blood sugar dysregulation left the studies with normal blood sugar readings. That's really, really positive. We don't see that with other solutions. And so we certainly need to be quite open to considering this as a solution. And remember, I said that magic number was kind of that 5% weight loss. In some of the trials on semaglutide, they're seeing like 75-80% of patients achieving that sort of critical number that we know changes their life, right? And so remember, we're not talking about how they look. We're talking about like cardiovascular events like heart attacks. And we can significantly change someone's potential for having a heart attack by using this medication for 1 year. We do also see some other positive changes like cholesterol, right? And blood pressure. And for the most part, those results are actually maintained. Actually, blood pressure probably comes back to normal, like wherever it was before you were on the medication. But we see improvement in cholesterol levels. We see reduction in blood pressure medication or blood pressure while people are on the drug, while they're on Ozempic or semaglutide. And so I always find that kind of interesting, right? So people, you know, we would say we want to avoid medication, or we're trying to take as few medications as possible. Like, what if the weight loss drug actually decreased your need for other medications? Now, how do we feel? You're like, shit, Jordan, don't make this decision more complicated than it needs to be. But remember, like, we're trying to break down that, you know, natural is best kind of rhetoric that we hear online. You have to ask the question, if your goal is not to take medication and one medication decreased your need for others, now how do we feel about it? And so in one of the particular studies, the author's name was Garvey, done in 2022, looking at, you know, patients who were on semaglutide for a year versus patients on placebo, a good, decent percentage of the patients in the active phase actually were able to decrease some of their medications. And this was really one of the first studies that actually looked at this. And my guess is we'll see more over time. But the placebo group actually had to increase their medication over the study period, right? They got more blood pressure medication. They got more cholesterol medication. Whereas the patients on semaglutide either didn't have to change their medication at all, or they decreased it, or they stopped it. And very few patients like progressed, air quotes, in needing more medication for the rest of their health because they were on the medication, the semaglutide. Tons and tons and tons of gastrointestinal side effects with this medication. Tons, like literally like 90% of patients have some GI side effects. I have heard of, or some of my clinicians have shared that they've heard that doctors have said that the you need to have the side effects, otherwise it's not working. I don't see any evidence of that in the literature, but it's just so common that it feels like it's part and parcel, that if you are on the medication, then you will have nausea or diarrhea. But interestingly, the discontinuation rate of the medication is almost zero. So when we're looking at side effects in a study, like certainly we want to grade the side effects, right? We want them to be mild and we don't want them to be severe or life-threatening side effects. But also we care about side effects and we care about dropouts. So if side effects are so significant that people stop the study, we want to make note of that, obviously. And yet in the studies that show such a high gastrointestinal side effects, the people don't leave the study. They keep going, which I think is really interesting because it means that they're maybe more mild. They also seem to go away. So, and this is a little anecdotal, but they seem to go away after that sort of dose escalation. As patients start this medication, it goes up and up and up and up in dose, and that seems to be where people have the most side effects. And funnily, in a lot of the placebo groups in the semaglutide trials, and the placebo group is the people that didn't get the active drug, they also have reported a lot of GI side effects. And so in one of the studies, 70% of the patients in the placebo group also had nausea and diarrhea, and they got nothing. So it's interesting because it was still significant, right? Like the people in the semaglutide group had more nausea, but it's interesting because often the patients can have GI side effects whether they're on medication or not, right? But I think the important piece there is that nobody seems to quit the drug over the side effects, even though the side effects are pretty endemic, like everyone has them, but people don't seem to quit the medication. So one of the things that influences decision-making for patients in medicine is how well they feel like they understand how something works. And which makes sense, right? If we don't know how something works and it's new, it feels risky. And it might be, right? Like 10 years from now, we might go like, oh my God, can you believe that I liked Ozempic? Because maybe we'll learn something new. I don't know. But we also have a bias in general that when we don't understand how something works, we want to avoid it. We tend to avoid it. And when new and novel treatments come out, even though they've been like really well studied, but maybe in a different population, or like their track record of use is actually incredibly good, we still avoid it. And so it's called the ambiguity bias. And it happens in patients. It also happens in doctors. And so if doctors have not spent time looking at the research on something, they might go, I don't know about how I feel about that. And it's just because they don't understand it. It's not because it doesn't work. But patients can do the same thing. And I think this is our 7-minute health appointments. Honestly, do not do this ambiguity bias any favors, because if you leave your appointment with questions and a prescription, there's a high probability that you're not going to take it because you feel like there's parts of it that are unanswered for you. And if you get home and you Google it and the TripAdvisor ratings on that particular drug say everybody gets nausea, and you didn't have time or you weren't able to ask your doctor about the nausea, you're not going to take it. And so I think, our trying to get some understanding across of what we do know about this medication is really important. One of our challenges is that we're embarking on a little bit of new territory here where we're considering using a medication that was designed for diabetes for more people. We don't 100% understand all of the mechanism of action for how it works. And when I posted on my social media, I said, who wants me to do a podcast about Ozempic? And you all said me. A lot of the feedback I got in my direct message was, can you talk about how it works? I'm like, well, we can, but we don't totally know how it works. And so that can create this level of uncertainty in patients around pursuing solutions when you don't know how it works. And so that's important. It's important for us to recognize, and it's important for us to create space to be able to ask questions and answer questions. the way I try and think about it, I mean, we've got some novel problems and obesity is not a novel disease. The complexity of our environment that is putting us at risk for obesity plus our genetics is a novel issue, right? In humanity. And we have a novel solution here that, we don't completely understand. I think it's kind of an interesting piece just to think about. Like, at what point would we feel like we had enough information to consider taking the risk of using this medication? And I will sometimes ask patients that question. And I'll say, is there anything that I can teach you about this that will change your mind? Or any questions that you have that if you had the answer, it would change your mind. And sometimes patients that the answer to that is no. They're like, no, actually, Jordan, I don't think there's anything you could say right now that would change the way I feel about needing to use medication for my obesity. It's like, okay, that's fair. Let's label that as a belief and move on. But if you think about it and you're like, you know what, there is this like tipping point. If I understood X, or if I knew someone who used it, whether that's a good reason or not, that's still how we make decisions. If my specialist was on board, if I saw a little bit more research, if I understood how my insurance company was going to process this, right? If there's something about the decision making that if you learned something or someone told you something or something was published that would change your mind, that's great, right? It means we're doing some fact collection and then making what we hope is an educated decision. But if I told you it was safe, if I told you we've studied tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people at this point, that the outcomes are really positive, that it's causing a significant enough change in BMI, and 2 years later, there's still enough of an improvement that it's changing people's lives, that the side effects are meh, they're there, but they don't cause anybody to quit the drug. We've now studied it in a youth population and demonstrated safety. If I told you all of those things and you're still like, I shouldn't have to take medication for my weight, I just want you to think about that, where that decision is coming from. Is it like this deep, poor relationship you have with someone in your family who's made you feel like if you could just white knuckle your way through some diet that your obesity would be cured? Is that where it's coming from? Is there shame around needing, I'm saying in air quotes, medication to treat your obesity? Have we done a good enough job helping you understand that this is a complex disease and not something that you're choosing? What is it, right? And I think if we dig deep and really try and understand this piece, and you can do this safely with a podcast, right? And, throw your earbuds in and listen to some hard questions. I think that this is a really, really, really important conversation, because it's hard for me to say anything negative about the drug. I was really worried about the weight regain and the extension trial of the step 1 trial, where they basically people graduated, they released them back into the wild, and then they checked in on them a year later. They still had a substantial reduction in BMI, and they didn't support them. They didn't do anything. Imagine if we supported you after that initial phase of using medication, and then we helped you, or we helped you make long-term behavior change, or supported your mental health or your sleep apnea, or whatever it was that was being part of the complex problem that is your obesity. Would our outcomes be better? I'd like to think so. And I think we can sit in this space where we definitely need upstream solutions for policy change for obesity, but we need a today solution too. And it 100% can look like everything that I do and that I offer patients: diet, lifestyle, mental health support, behavior change, time management, and medication. It can 100% look like that. And if you're struggling, and if you felt nervous to even approach this conversation with your doctor, I hope today's conversation has given you a little bit more insight about what to think about these drugs, or at least started to challenge some of our beliefs about these medications, because where we sit right now is that they are going to be a life-saving medication for many. So why would we withhold that? I'll see you next week.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.